Kaspar Goebell, or Gable, according to researcher Raymond Cable, was likely born near Hanover, Germany in about 1755, although some claim Rodenhausen in the province of Hesse. He was a young ministerial student when, according to a written account by his great-grandson Isaac Doherty, Casper's father, quote, arranged a marriage for him with a girl who was many years older and who was badly scarred by smallpox. As the wedding date drew near, he became desperate and ran away to join the German army, unquote. Meanwhile, King Frederick II of Hesse, who was married to the daughter of King George II of Great Britain, agreed to provide up to 30,000 conscripts or draftees to help the British crush the American colonial revolt. King Frederick was to be paid $500,000 per year, and in addition, $35 for each soldier killed and $12 for each one wounded. Whether Kaspar joined the army voluntarily as recounted by Doherty, or was literally seized like most of the young men, he joined about 22,000 others that would make up the Hessian army and include 4 battalions of grenadiers or infantrymen. It would eventually make up about 1/4 of the British invading force. According to a diary kept by 16-year-old Johannes Ruber, after taking the oath of grenadier in the Rahl Regiment, they left Bremen on April 16, 1776, and after a brief stop in Portsmouth, England, sailed to America on May 6th. Ruber wrote that the voyage was dismal and prolonged, encountering severe storms in May and heavy fog in June. They finished their voyage without fresh water and provisions, surviving on rotting biscuits and foul water. Many of the men had scurvy and swollen legs. They arrived in New York Harbor on August 14th, only 40 days after the colonists had defiantly signed a Declaration of Independence. Ruber wrote, quote, our command ship fired a feu de joie with 32 cannon shots. The English also took part because of the safe arrival of the Hessians in America. We sailed both fleets mixed together into the harbor near Staten Island, and thereby our voyage was ended happily, unquote. Even though 700 to 800 men had fever and diarrhea, within a week they were on the move. Casper likely participated in the Battle of Brooklyn, also known as the Battle of Long Island, and on August 27th, the Hessians and British had the Americans trapped between them. Ruber wrote, quote, we could see the rebel corps with flags flying. Colonel Rahl directed the regiment to fire at the Americans. When they saw what was in store, they surrendered and dropped their rifles and laid down their weapons. A non-commissioned officer of our regiment seized the rebel flag, unquote. The Americans had been outnumbered 3-1, and the British and Hessians quickly captured New York, burning a quarter of the buildings. They executed Continental Army captain and spy Nathan Hale, who became an American hero by famously exclaiming just before he was hanged, I regret that I have but one life to lose for my country. The only good news for the Americans was that General Washington had escaped during the night with what remained of his army after mass desertion to the farmlands of western Pennsylvania. On December 14th, Colonel Rahl arrived with about 1,400 Hessians in Trenton, New Jersey, to establish winter quarters. Trenton was a small town with about 100 houses along the banks of the Delaware River, separating New Jersey from Pennsylvania. Colonel Rahl kept his men on alert in spite of reports of low morale among Washington's army and not likely to attack. The following diary entries by Ruber describe the conditions in Trenton. Quote, December 18th. It was quiet for us at Trenton, and we posted our watches, commands, and pickets as usual. It also began to freeze, which was our desire, as we would be able to cross the river and capture Philadelphia. December 21st. Everything was quiet and peaceful. Nevertheless, it was ordered that every evening a company was to remain in the alert house with our rifles stacked before the house door. December 24th. On Christmas Eve in the afternoon, there were sudden alarm shots at our outposts, but nothing happened. Everyone had to enter the alert houses and occupy our positions, unquote. On Christmas Day, 1776, Washington's army broke camp and prepared for an after-dark crossing of the Delaware River for a sneak attack on Trenton before dawn. The crossing, about 9 miles upstream from Trenton, was supposed to have been completed by midnight. but the logistics of moving 2,400 men across the icy river in boats was underestimated, and they fell behind schedule. To make matters worse, a winter storm moved in about 11 p.m., bringing a mixture of snow and sleet. The crossing was not completed until 3 a.m. Washington marched his men the 9 miles toward Trenton, many of them freezing and without shoes, and leaving bloody footprints. The storm delayed the attack until 8 a.m., December 26th. Popular belief holds that when Washington arrived with his army at Trenton, the Hessians were sleeping off hangovers from Christmas celebrations. The eyewitness account of American attacker John Greenwood sets the record straight. Quote, "I have heard that we surprised the enemy, but any who would ever suppose such a thing must indeed be ignorant, when it is well known that our whole country was filled with informers of all descriptions, and our march so slow that it was impossible but they should be apprised of it. It was likewise asserted that the enemy were all drunk. I can swear that we were all sober to a man, and I am willing to go upon oath that I did not see even a solitary drunken soldier belonging to the enemy. As we advanced, it being dark and stormy so that we could not see very far ahead, we got within 200 yards of about 300 to 400 Hessians who were paraded two deep in a straight line with Colonel Rahl, their commander, on horseback to the right of them." Unquote. Surprised or not, once the shooting started, events moved quickly. Greenwood again. Quote, "They made a full fire at us, but I did not see that they killed anyone. As we had been in the storm all night, we were not only wet through and through ourselves, but our guns and powder were wet also. When we were all ready, we advanced, and although there was not more than one bayonet per 5 men, orders were given to charge bayonets and rush all on, and rush on we did. Within pistol shot, they again fired. We dodged, and they did not hit a man. Before they had time to reload, we were within 3 feet of them, when they broke in an instant and ran into town, we after them pell-mell." Unquote. The Americans attacked from two directions, while artillery was poured into the midst of the Hessian garrison. Johannes Ruber's perspective from the other side. Quote, "At daybreak, the Americans marched against our 100-man picket. At the same time, the Americans fired on our outposts. At the first salvo, we turned out from our alert houses and went to the alert areas to form and prepare our battle formations. Now the rebels pressed down on us. The Americans charged Colonel Rahl's quarters, overran it, and took the cannons from the regiment. Then Colonel Rahl charged with his grenadiers. Although we went against enemy cannons, Colonel Rahl commanded, 'All those who are my grenadiers, charge.' The rebels, in 3 lines, marched around us, and as we tried to retreat, they brought 7 cannons into the main street. We had to go past them, but things went badly for us before we could accomplish this purpose." Unquote. The Continental soldiers quickly gained entrance to the civilian houses and caught the Hessians in a crossfire from their smoothbore rifles. Rahl's army, outnumbered 2 to 1, was unable to form any organized resistance. Rahl was fatally wounded, and his men retreated to an orchard in the southeast end of town, where they were surrounded. Kaspar Goebell, along with the rest of the Hessians, surrendered to Washington's Continental Army. By 9:30 a.m., it was all over. Greenwood continues, quote, "After passing a number of dead and wounded Hessians, we reached the other side of town, and on our right beheld about 500 to 600 of the enemy paraded two deep in a field. They had been taken prisoner by another party, and we marched between them and their guns, which they had laid on the ground. A few minutes afterward, a number of wagons came up behind us, into which the guns were placed. Our regiment was then ordered to conduct them down to the ferry and transport them to the other side. The Hessian prisoners, who were all grenadiers, numbered about 900. The scow which was used in transporting them over the ferry was half a leg deep with rain and snow, and some of the poor fellows were so cold that their underjaws quivered like an aspen leaf. On the march down to the boat, seeing some of our men were much pleased with the brass caps which they had taken from the dead Hessians, our prisoners, who were besides exceedingly frightened, pulled off those that they were wearing, and giving them away, put on the hats which they carried tied behind their packs. With these brass, it was laughable to see how our soldiers would strut, fellows with their elbows out and some without a collar to their half a shirt and no shoes." Unquote. No Americans had been killed, and only 4 were wounded. 20 Hessians were killed and about 100 wounded. The rest, about 1,000 men, were captured, Kaspar Goebell and Johannes Ruber among them. One of the most famous paintings in America depicts the Battle of Trenton, Emanuel Lutz's Washington Crossing the Delaware, displayed at the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art. It is interesting that our ancestor was likely witness to such historic events in our nation's history, depicted on priceless canvases. Trenton, New Jersey, December 26, 1776, was the epicenter for a seminal event involving a who's who of early American historical figures. Besides Washington, it is possible that Kaspar saw or even exchanged gunfire with two more future presidents, James Madison and James Monroe, or perhaps with John Marshall, Aaron Burr, or Alexander Hamilton. The effect of the Battle of Trenton turned out to be beyond all proportion to the number involved and the casualties sustained. The colonies were galvanized by the stunning victory, and the psychological advantage of the British Army quickly evaporated. But what of Kaspar and his fellow Hessians? Look for part 2 of The First Cable Ancestor in America.